Welcome back to Who Shot JFK. We're switching gears a little today. Instead of our usual format, we're going to take a deep dive into a single book called Oswald and the CIA.
Ooh, this is gonna be good.
It really gets into Oswald's life before the assassination.
Before Dealey Plaza.
Yeah, exactly. And it focuses specifically on his connections to, well,
CIA.
you got it. And I think our listeners will be really fascinated to hear what this book has to say.
I agree. I think what's so compelling about this particular book is how it uses all these newly declassified documents.
To give us a clearer picture of Oswald.
Yes, a picture that's much more complex than just that lone gunman narrative. We're going to really explore Oswald's time in the Soviet Union.
His potential ties to different intelligence agencies.
Oh yeah, all that and more. Buckle up.
It's like we're stepping back in time trying to understand the man, not just the name that everybody knows. Like, who is Lee Harvey Oswald before November 22nd, 1963?
Absolutely. And one of the things that really jumped out at me while reading this book was the massive response Oswald's defection to the Soviet Union in 1959 triggered.
From all these different agencies.
Yeah, FBI, CIA, even the Navy. I mean, everyone was all over this case. It really makes you wonder.
What was it about Oswald that caused such huge interest?
Right. Was it just the defection itself, or was there something more? The book really digs into all the inconsistencies and gaps in these early files on Oswald.
And there are a lot of them.
A lot. For example, like Oswald's offer to share military knowledge with the Soviets. I mean, that alone was a huge red flag, especially considering his background as a radar operator at Atsugi Naval Air Station in Japan.
Atsugi. Of course, that was the base for the top-secret U-2 spy plane program.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder, what exactly did Oswald know? And could that knowledge have been a threat to national security?
That's a really good question. And here's where things get even more interesting. The book talks about how the CIA initially downplayed all these pre-assassination files on Oswald.
They were calling them routine.
Routine, right. But then later on, it turned out some of these files actually contained classified information. And it just makes you think, what were they trying to hide?
It really does. It almost seems like they were trying to keep certain information about Oswald completely compartmentalized, especially anything connecting his defection to programs like the U-2. The book even uses this phrase, Oswald black hole, within the CIA.
That's a pretty powerful image. It's like all this information about Oswald is going in, but nothing is coming out.
Exactly.
So we have Oswald defecting to the Soviet Union in 1959, but while he's in Moscow, he tries to renounce his U.S. citizenship.
And he ends up having contact with several officials at the U.S. Embassy, including Richard Snyder, the consul.
Right. But then there's this other figure that pops up in the book, John McVicker.
Yeah, also stationed at the embassy. But he's a bit of an enigma.
It seems like McVicker had this unusual access to information about Oswald, even things that Snyder himself didn't know.
Yeah, for instance, the book describes how McVicker predicted Oswald's job assignment in the Soviet Union before it was even officially announced. Snyder was completely baffled by this.
Two journalists, Aline Mosby and Priscilla Johnson, they both interviewed Oswald while he was in Moscow.
And even they said they couldn't quite figure him out.
Like he was this puzzle they just couldn't solve.
Yeah. The book explores the possibility that McVicker had sources inside the Soviet government or even within U.S. intelligence, which makes things even more intriguing.
Okay, so we've got Oswald defecting, then we've got this mysterious McVicker lurking in the background. This is already starting to sound like a spy novel.
Right. Defection, espionage, Cold War tensions, it's all there. And it gets even more fascinating when we start talking about Oswald's connections to a woman named June Cobb.
June Cobb. She was connected to both Fidel Castro and the CIA, right?
Yes. Her story intersects with Oswald's in some pretty surprising ways, particularly through one of her associates, Richard Gibson.
And if I remember correctly, Gibson was a member of the FPCC, the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, and he was caught on tape by the CIA discussing some pretty sensitive information about Cuba.
You're right. And apparently, some of this intelligence had been gathered right from Cobb's own apartment.
So you have this web of connections, Oswald, Cuba, the CIA, and then Cobb and her circle.
It's a lot to untangle, that's for sure.
Now, just a quick note for our listeners. You'll be hearing us mention the FPCC a lot. That's the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, the pro-Castro group. And you might also hear us talk about the DRE, the Directorio Revolucionario Estudiantil, the anti-Castro group. It's important to keep those two organizations in mind as we go through Oswald's story.
Absolutely. They play a big part in understanding the political landscape that Oswald was navigating.
Okay, so we have Oswald defecting to the Soviet Union, but he's also expressing interest in Cuba. And then we have this mysterious figure, McVicker, And now we're bringing June Cobb into the mix.
It's already getting pretty complicated.
It is. And it's about to get even more complicated as we dig deeper into Oswald's activities in New Orleans.
Oh, yeah, that's where things get really interesting.
But before we get there, we need to take a quick break, so stay with us. We'll be right back after this.
Okay, so let's pick up where we left off and talk about Oswald's trip to Mexico City just a few months before the assassination. This trip is always kind of shrouded in mystery, you know?
Oh, yeah. Conflicting accounts. Always a lot of debate about what really happened.
Right, exactly. He visited both the Soviet and Cuban consulates, but the specifics of those visits are still up in the air. It's almost impossible to know for sure what went down.
It's a maze, for sure.
And to make things even more complicated, the CIA was intercepting Oswald's phone calls and had him under surveillance the entire time he was in Mexico City.
Wait, so they were still watching him? I thought we talked about those lapses in surveillance.
It seems so, but here's where things get really strange. The book reveals that there was actually an imposter making calls using Oswald's name, like someone was pretending to be him.
An imposter. Okay, now this is getting wild. Who was this imposter? And why were they doing that? What was the point?
Those are the big questions, aren't they? Was this some elaborate attempt to frame Oswald? Or maybe create a false trail leading back to Cuba or the Soviets? The book really dives deep into these questions, examining all the evidence and exploring all the different possibilities.
It makes you wonder about the CIA's role in all of this.
Yeah.
Were they aware of this imposter? I mean, were they somehow in on it?
Right. Those are some tough questions that the book brings up, and it doesn't necessarily provide any concrete answers. But it's worth pointing out that the CIA has always been extremely tight-lipped about Oswald's activities in Mexico City.
Yeah, and some researchers believe they might still be holding back information.
Absolutely. It's definitely possible. And this whole imposter thing just adds more fuel to the conspiracy fire.
It does. Okay, so we talked earlier about the CIA files on Oswald. The ones that were initially downplayed as routine, but then later found to contain classified information.
Yes. The book actually introduces this fascinating concept of hidden compartments within these files.
Like there's information hidden within the files themselves?
Well, more like information was intentionally compartmentalized, kept away from certain people, secrets within secrets, basically.
So not only were they potentially hiding information, they might have also been controlling who had access to what.
That's exactly what the book argues. It suggests that this wasn't just about protecting sensitive information, it was about shaping the narrative around Oswald, controlling what people knew or thought they knew about him.
Wow. But why would they do that?
Yeah.
What would be the purpose of manipulating the perception of Oswald, especially within the intelligence community?
That's a tough question, and I don't think we have a definitive answer, but it's definitely something worth considering. It just shows how deep this rabbit hole goes.
It does. Okay, so we've got these mysterious CIA files with hidden compartments, conflicting accounts of what Oswald was really up to in Mexico City, and this shadowy imposter making calls in his name. It's almost overwhelming how much we don't know.
Right. And it feels like every time you think you're getting closer to the truth, another layer of complexity is revealed.
This book, Oswald and the CIA, is really good at exposing those complexities. It really forces you to look beyond that simple lone gunman narrative and consider the possibility that Oswald was involved in something much bigger, something with intelligence agencies, covert operations, maybe even a cover-up.
Absolutely. And remember, this is all happening in the context of some major historical events. The Bay of Pigs invasion, the CIA's attempts to assassinate Castro. The political climate was incredibly tense.
Yeah. You have individuals connected to these assassination plots, people like Guy Bannister, for example, who was this former FBI agent turned staunch anti-communist.
And he was operating right there in New Orleans, the same city where Oswald would later surface.
So we have Oswald entangled with the CIA, with Cuba, and now this network of anti-Castro operatives in New Orleans. It's all connected somehow.
It's a tangled web, for sure.
Okay, let's take a step back for a moment and look at Oswald's return to the United States in 1962. The FBI was keeping a close eye on him, monitoring his mail, tracking his movements, even watching his wife, Marina.
You would think with all that surveillance, they would have known everything about him.
Right. But here's another thing that just doesn't add up. The book points out these weird lapses in the FBI surveillance. There were times when they seemingly lost track of him completely, like when he moved to New Orleans, for instance.
Yeah, and even during his early involvement with the FPCC, there were periods where their surveillance was spotty at best.
Wait, so they lost track of him, the guy they were supposed to be watching 24/7. How is that even possible?
It's a question that a lot of researchers have struggled with over the years. These lapses in surveillance really make you wonder how closely Oswald was actually being monitored and what information the FBI might have missed during those crucial periods.
It definitely adds another layer of mystery to the whole thing.
Now, let's shift gears and focus on Oswald's activities in New Orleans. This is where things take a really interesting turn. We see him trying to infiltrate both pro-Castro and anti-Castro groups.
Playing both sides almost.
Yeah, exactly. He's trying to insert himself into these politically charged groups, each with their own agendas and connections. And it raises all sorts of questions about his true motivations.
Was he a double agent? A provocateur?
Yeah.
Or just someone who wanted to be at the center of the action?
Who knows? But his actions definitely put him in a dangerous position, right in the middle of these rival factions with ties to intelligence agencies.
He even gets into a public brawl with Carlos Brignier, who was a leader of the anti-Castro DRE.
Right. Oswald was distributing pro-Castro leaflets, and Brignier confronted him. It was a pretty big deal at the time.
And this whole incident leads to Oswald's arrest.
But here's the strange part. While he's in jail, Oswald demands to speak to the FBI. He wants to give them information about his pro-Castro activities.
That's a weird move. Who does that?
It's almost as if he wanted to make himself a person of interest.
Yeah.
Or maybe he was playing some kind of mind game with the authorities.
I don't know. His motives are so hard to decipher.
They really are. All of his actions in New Orleans, this whole incident with Brignier and the FBI, it really paints this picture of someone who was deeply enmeshed in the political turmoil of the Cold War, someone who seemed to crave the spotlight, to be at the center of the storm.
Okay, before we get too far ahead of ourselves, I think we need to pause here and let everything sink in for a moment. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have. We started with Oswald's trip to Mexico City, where we encountered that mysterious imposter and learned about the CIA's possible involvement in withholding information.
And then we went back to those CIA files on Oswald, talking about those hidden compartments and the potential for manipulating the narrative surrounding him.
Right. And we even touched on the CIA's dealings with the HSCA, the House Select Committee on Assassinations, which raised some serious concerns about their transparency and their role in shaping the public's understanding of the assassination.
It's been quite a journey so far.
It has. And it's not over yet. We still have some big questions to grapple with. What does all of this mean? How does it change our understanding of the Kennedy assassination itself?
Those are the questions we'll be tackling in the final part of our deep dive into Oswald and the CIA. So stay tuned, folks. This is where things get really interesting. Okay, so after all that, the big question is, what does it all mean? I mean, we've gone through this whole deep dive into Oswald and the CIA, and we've uncovered some pretty wild stuff about Oswald's connections to the CIA and all these efforts to control information about him. But what does all that tell us about the assassination itself?
Yeah, that's the core issue, right? This book doesn't say, here's who shot JFK. It doesn't give us that answer.
Right.
It's important to keep that in mind. But what it does do, though, is argue that Oswald's story is way more complicated than what we've been told, and that all his ties to the CIA, those raise some really big questions about whether they were involved in what happened leading up to November 22nd, 1963.
Before reading this book, I honestly thought I had a pretty good handle on the Kennedy assassination. Lone gunman, Oswald acted alone, end of story, right? But Oswald and the CIA has made me question everything.
I think that's what a good book like this is supposed to do, challenge what we think we know and make us look at things in a new way.
The book doesn't come out and say the CIA was behind the assassination, but it does lay out a lot of circumstantial evidence, like the hidden compartments in Oswald's files, the misleading information they gave to the HSCA, that whole imposter thing in Mexico City. It's hard to ignore all of that.
And don't forget about those lapses in FBI surveillance, especially at key moments in Oswald's life. It makes you wonder, were they really trying to keep tabs on him? Or were they letting him slip through the cracks on purpose?
It feels like trying to solve a puzzle, but someone's gone and hidden half the pieces.
Exactly. We might never have all the answers, but the pieces we do have suggest it's not as simple as a lone gunman.
So where do we go from here? I mean, will we ever truly get to the bottom of this? There's still so much classified information out there.
It's true, and it's possible that some evidence has been lost or destroyed over time. But that shouldn't stop us from searching for the truth, even if it's uncomfortable or challenges what we believe.
I think Oswald and the CIA makes a really strong case for continuing to investigate the Kennedy assassination and for questioning the official narrative. We can't just accept what we've been told. We have to dig deeper and consider all the possibilities.
I completely agree. And, this book really underscores the importance of critical thinking, of being skeptical, and of questioning authority.
Especially when it comes to events that have shaped our history, like the Kennedy assassination.
Exactly. That's a crucial takeaway for everyone listening. Don't just take things at face value. Do your research, ask questions, and consider different viewpoints. The truth is out there, but it might take some effort to find it.
So to everyone listening, if you want to learn more about this, I highly recommend checking out Oswald and the CIA for yourself. It's a fascinating read that will challenge your assumptions and give you a whole new perspective on this pivotal event in American history.
It's one of those books that stays with you long after you finished it, prompting you to question everything you thought you knew.
This deep dive into Oswald and the CIA has been a real eye-opener for me, and I hope it has been for you too. It's a reminder that the search for truth is never-ending. There's always more to learn, even about events that happened decades ago. And hopefully someday, we might get a clearer picture of what really happened on that day in Dallas. Until then, the mystery of the Kennedy assassination continues to fascinate and intrigue us, and books like this one keep that conversation going. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep those critical thinking caps on, and never stop questioning the narrative.